Hi. Today we're talking about the different best practices found in distant education. So, I have found three articles in which they describe the different best practices that they have came across and basically what those entail. So, the first article that I've been able to research is titled "Priorities in K through 12 Distant Education," a Delphi study examining multiple perspectives on policy, practice, and research, by Kerry Rice, 2009. I also have Virtual Schools, The Changing Landscapes of K 12 Education in the U.S. And that's by the Toplin couple, Sheila and Ian. And the third article is Virtual School Startups, Founder, Processes in K 12 Public Virtual Schools, basically entailing what it takes to start up a virtual school. And I thought that article might give some insightful thoughts on some best practices that you need to really consider when trying to start a virtual school that may also continue through the practice of the entire school. Some things that you might not consider unless you're going from scratch to start it. So just to see what they would say. Gain a lot of great perspectives. Well, the first article noted that traditional schools have no experience in virtual education, and that at first took me really aback. And I thought, well, surely an institution would have some kind of knowledge or background on every kind of way to educate, including virtual and distance learning. But as I dove a little deeper, it does make more sense. It says that the study examines the foundational processes at three California virtual schools in traditional education. And it says that the analysis led to the conclusion that in traditional education, virtual school sites perceive the following as key founding processes: the preliminary research, district support, teacher and staff selection, financial evaluation, and the curriculum decisions. Those were the best practices to focus on when really trying to get into the area of virtual education. Some things that sound like common sense, but actually are great to be outlined. Article 2 discussed the best practices according to Toplin 2016. Quote, it is no longer far-fetched to conclude that if the current trends continues, virtual school enrollments will eclipse those of traditional brick-and-mortar K-12 institutions within the next 10 years, end quote. I totally agree. I've said this myself. I said that the true purpose of me even obtaining this degree in educational technology with online instruction is because, yes, within the next 10 to 20 years, at least, schools are going to change with a heavy, if not completely, total usage of just virtual or distance education. Traditional brick and mortar, as they mentioned, for K through 12 is slowly, sadly, but is slowly issuing itself out of the norm. I just see distance and virtual education becoming something that is not only convenient for students and parents, but almost less of a hassle. You don't always, and it, of course, everything has its both sides to it, but I do see it being less of a hassle. And I also see some parents stating that some of the issues that they deal with socially with their children inside of public schools or just traditional brick and mortar schools in general, for example, bullying, parent-teacher relationships, teacher-student relationships, parent-administrator relationships, are then all eliminated when you go to a virtual school to an extent, because you don't have to deal with just these personality issues or just having to deal with being with the student all day, and just it goes on and on and on. But they do also note that there are some critical areas in which you should consider when you're looking at virtual school and the framework. So what they mentioned was the academics, the fiscalness of it, the geographic information, the governance information, labor and management, legal, student support services, technical and cultural support. So those are things that you should think about when building a framework for a virtual school. They also had this great quote. It says, rapid growth of K-12 virtual academics is outpacing researchers. This is interesting. Ability to study the phenomenon and generate data, which supports best practice. So essentially they're saying that there is not great amounts of research on the best practices of virtual education, because virtual education, in a sense, when it comes to traditional schools or brick and mortar schools and their knowledge and experience with virtual education, is zero to none. So the research on the best practices for a virtual education or just distance learning experience is not a lot, if at all. Very interesting. It says there are little or limited research on the success of teaching and learning of online schools. And even though, honestly, virtual education, in the sense of just being an online platform, started in the 90s. And so you would think that almost 20 years of dealing with this genre of education, that they would have some kind of substantial amount of best practice research, but evidently we don't. The last article states from Taylor and McNair, 2018, that according to the Delphi method, which is the study they chose to use, of group of communication was used, and with experienced distant education stakeholders, principals, parents, teachers, students, in the U.S., and the Delphi panel members advocated the following areas as priority for K through 12 distance education over the next 5 years. And those areas were evaluation of the course design and delivery, the best practices. So they do know that we do need to include that. Accountability, I guess, in terms of students' work, teacher work, and all those areas. Access to it, online technology, professional development, accreditation and standards, funding, and technology. This third article for me really hit home. I feel like they did a great job at being able to analyze what it would take not only to have as a foundation for virtual school or a distant learning program, but also all the key factors to make it sustainable. When you think about all those 9 things that they just listed, all of those things are parts of which come from traditional brick and mortar education. Outside of maybe best practices, which would be tailored directly toward distance education, all of these same 9 elements still are being considered and are used as a framework for traditional education. You have to know the evaluation of the design and delivery of the content and curriculum in which you're using. You have to know what those best practices are to send those down the pipeline to make sure they're still being implemented. Accountability still has to be there. Teachers have to have some kind of record data for their lessons that they're giving, even if it's just a lesson plan. And students need to be accountable for the work they're submitting. Professional development is always something that you have to consider in any institution. You want your professionals to be able to continuously grow and adapt to changes. Accreditation is one of the biggest things that's concerning education for traditional brick and mortar, not only K through 12, but definitely higher education. Accreditation is the basis of the curriculum and anything that you do for that institution. And without it, you really have no strong foundation to sit on. And so those accreditations and those standards that you're going to teach, be it Common Core or whatever has been adopted for your state, need to be clear. Access to the virtual education site platform needs to be 100% accessible. There's just no way around that, or essentially you don't get to have virtual education. And with that being said, your online technology and funding and just technology as a whole has to be intact to make this a successful run. And the results of this framework and the study of that provides a specific priority areas needed to be addressed by those engaged in all facets of the K through 12 distant education. And so here we have it. Best practices are being able to really figure out, and my biggest takeaway from these 3 articles, as I identified the best practices that they've identified, in summary, I feel that you have to have a key framework in which you're going to build your virtual education or distance educational program. That framework needs to include some very specific key areas that will help not only begin but sustain your institution. Thank you.